6 hours. That's how long Kathy Stone had been carrying a secret on her face, a violent purple bruise that bloomed across her cheekbone like a warning, a brand, a threat she couldn't escape. 6 hours since Vice President Park had slammed her against the corridor wall, his breath hot with whiskey and rage, his words dripping with venom. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, or you'll lose more than this job.
Stop
6 hours of
lying to
layering
me.
foundation over
You know
swollen skin,
exactly what
of pressing
happens if
ice-cold
they find
spoons
us
against the
here.
discoloration in the staff bathroom,
Please,
of rehearsing
I
excuses in
swear
the mirror.
I
I
didn't see
fell.
anything.
I'm clumsy. I walked into a door knowing no one would care enough to ask anyway. But survival has a price, and when the head housekeeper yanked her from the supply closet and shoved a tray of imported water into her trembling hands, barking orders to serve the quarterly board meeting because the regular girl called in sick, Kathy knew her time was up. She couldn't afford to say no. Couldn't afford to draw attention. Couldn't afford to lose the only income keeping her family's lights on and her little brother in school. So she walked into that boardroom past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, past the 20 most powerful men in tailored suits who didn't even glance her way, past the gleaming mahogany table that cost more than she'd earned in 5 years with her head down and her heart hammering against her ribs. But heat doesn't care about makeup. Sweat doesn't respect concealer. And when the overhead lights hit her face at just the wrong angle, the foundation cracked. 1 second. That's all it took for Jae-shin Kwon, CEO, billionaire, the man they whispered about in shadows and back alleys, the dragon who built an empire on blood and precision to see it. His hand froze mid-signature. His dark eyes, usually calm and calculating, turned into something feral, something ancient and unforgiving. The room didn't notice. They were too busy arguing about quarterly projections and market shares and mergers. Too important to see the Maid, too powerful to care. But Jae-shin rose from his chair with the kind of silence that makes prey animals go still. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small black remote, and pressed a single button. Click! The sound of the magnetic locks engaging on the heavy glass doors was soft, almost polite. But in that pristine boardroom on the 47th floor, it was the sound of a cage door slamming shut. 20 executives froze, some mid-sentence, some mid-sip of coffee, all of them suddenly, brutally aware that something had shifted, that the man at the head of the table was no longer their CEO. He was something else entirely. Jae-shin moved with terrifying calm, crossing the room in 3 strides and pulling Kathy against his chest, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, protective and possessive. His hand splayed across her back like a shield. The other hand held the remote high, a silent declaration of control. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice soft as silk and sharp as a blade. "We have a problem." The air turned to ice. "Someone in this room." He tilted Kathy's face gently toward the light, exposing the bruise in all its ugly, violent glory. "Put their hands on something that belongs to me." Kathy's fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket, her nails digging through the expensive wool. Not because she was afraid of him, but because in this room full of monsters in suits, he was the only one who'd ever looked at her like she mattered. "So here's what's going to happen," Jae-shin continued, his tone never rising, never breaking. "No one leaves, no one calls for help, no one breathes wrong. Not until I know exactly who touched her." A chair scraped. Someone cleared their throat. Mr. Park, the vice president, forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Sir, surely this is—" "Shut up," 2 words, spoken with the kind of quiet that comes before executions. They knew the rumors, that Kwon Corp was a front, that their CEO had built his fortune in the shadows, that his hands were stained with more than ink, that the smiling businessman who signed their checks was really a dragon in a $1,000 suit. Now, they were trapped in his lair, and one of them was about to burn. Before we continue to see who walks out of that boardroom alive, take a moment to subscribe and drop a comment telling me what you think Jae-shin will do to the man who touched Kathy. It truly means so much to see this community grow with every story we tell. Every like, every share, every comment you leave helps us bring more untold stories to life together. Because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the moment when a woman who's been invisible her entire life becomes the only thing a dangerous man can see. The staff bathroom on the third floor of Quan Tower smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. Kathy Stone stood at the cracked mirror, her reflection fractured into 3 uneven pieces, and tried to make herself invisible again. Her hands shook as she twisted open the drugstore foundation, the cheap kind that came in a plastic tube and promised full coverage in bold letters that felt like lies. She'd already applied 2 layers. The bruise still showed through like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Purple, angry, unmistakable. She dabbed more product onto her cheekbone, wincing as her fingers grazed the swollen skin. The pain was sharp and immediate, a reminder that last night had been real. That Vice President Park's hand connecting with her face in the dim corridor had been real. That his threat hissed through clenched teeth while his fingers dug into her arm hard enough to leave fingerprints had been real. You saw nothing. You heard nothing. Or you'll lose more than this job, sweetheart. Kathy blinked hard, forcing the memory back down where it belonged. She couldn't afford to think about it, couldn't afford to feel it. She had 4 hours left in her shift, a little brother who needed new textbooks, and a mother whose medication didn't pay for itself. She needed this job, which meant she needed to be invisible, which meant the bruise had to disappear. She added another layer, then another. The makeup was thick now, cakey, obvious if anyone looked too close, but no one ever looked at the help. That was the blessing and the curse of being a maid in a building full of people who measured their worth in zeros on a paycheck. Kathy was a ghost, and ghosts didn't have bruises. She was blending the edges with a damp sponge when the bathroom door slammed open hard enough to rattle the stalls. Mrs. Cho, the head housekeeper, stood in the doorway like a drill sergeant who'd caught a soldier sleeping on watch. Stone, you're needed upstairs. Kathy's stomach dropped. I'm scheduled for the executive suites today, Mrs. Cho. I was just about to change of plans. Mrs. Cho's voice was clipped, impatient. She held a wooden tray in her hands, the expensive kind reserved for VIP meetings, the kind Kathy had only seen from a distance. Hannah called in sick. You're covering the quarterly board meeting. The words landed like a punch to the gut. The board meeting? But I've never... You have hands, don't you? You can carry water? Mrs. Cho shoved the tray forward. Crystal glasses. Imported bottled water with labels in languages Kathy couldn't read. 47th floor. Conference room A. And for God's sake, don't speak unless spoken to. These men don't have time for small talk. Kathy took the tray with numb fingers. The weight of it felt wrong, too heavy, like she was carrying something fragile that would shatter the moment she moved. Mrs. Cho, I really don't think... I don't pay you to think. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. You're already 10 minutes late. Move. There was no arguing with Mrs. Cho. There was no arguing with anyone when you were 1 paycheck away from eviction. So, Kathy nodded, straightened her apron, and walked out of the bathroom with her heart lodged somewhere in her throat. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending into a different world. The walls were polished marble. The floors were heated. The air smelled like money and power and things Kathy would never be able to afford. She checked her reflection in the elevator's mirrored panel. The bruise was still there, faint but visible under the wrong light. She angled her face down, letting her hair fall forward. Maybe if she kept her head low, if she moved fast enough, no one would notice. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Conference room A was at the end of a long hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than her yearly salary. Through the glass walls, she could see them 20 men in suits so expensive they looked like uniforms, sitting around a table that stretched the length of the room. And at the head of that table, backlit by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a kingdom he owned, sat Jae-shin Kwon. Kathy had seen him before. Everyone who worked in this building had seen him, but seeing him from across a lobby and seeing him up close were two different things. He looked like he'd been carved from stone and dressed in shadows. His suit was black on black, tailored so perfectly it might have been painted on. His hair was slicked back, revealing a face that belonged on magazine covers or movie screens, sharp jawline, high cheekbones, eyes so dark they looked like they could see straight through lies. He was beautiful in the way predators were beautiful. Dangerous. Untouchable. Absolutely in control. Kathy's hands tightened on the tray. She could do this. She just had to walk in, set down the water, and leave. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Be invisible. Be quiet. Be gone. She pushed open the glass door with her hip, keeping her head down, her eyes on the tray. The room fell silent as she entered, but not the kind of silence that meant they noticed her. It was the silence of people too important to be interrupted, too focused on their own power plays to care about the help. Good. She moved along the edge of the room, setting down glasses one by one. Her hands were steady, her breathing was controlled. She was almost done, almost safe. But the room was warm. Too warm. The overhead lights were too bright, and sweat, nervous, terrified sweat began to bead along her hairline, trickling down her temple. She felt it before she saw it. The foundation, thick and cheap and never meant to last, beginning to break apart, sliding, smudging. She set down the last glass in front of an executive who didn't even glance her way. Relief flooded through her. She was done. She could leave. She turned toward the door. Wait. The voice was quiet, calm, but it cut through the room like a blade through silk. Every executive froze. Phones paused mid-scroll. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Kathy's feet stopped moving. She didn't turn around, didn't look up, didn't breathe. Come here. It wasn't a request. Her legs moved on autopilot, carrying her toward the head of the table where Jae-shin sat with his fingers steepled in front of him. She kept her eyes down, kept her face angled away from the light. Look at me. She couldn't. If she looked at him, he'd see. If he saw, he'd ask questions. If he asked questions, she'd lose this job, and if she lost this job, everything else would collapse like dominoes. Kathy. Her name in his mouth sounded different. Familiar. Like he'd said it before in moments she didn't remember. Look. At. Me. She lifted her chin. Just enough. Just barely. His eyes found the bruise immediately. The change in him was instant. Subtle, but absolute. His expression didn't shift. His posture didn't change. But something in the air around him turned sharp, cold, lethal. Who? His voice was still quiet, still calm, but underneath it was a promise of violence so profound that Kathy felt it in her bones. I. Her voice cracked. It's nothing, sir. Who touched you? The room was so silent she could hear her own heartbeat. Jae-shin stood. Slowly, like a predator rising from rest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote, the kind that controlled building security. His thumb hovered over a button. Sir? One of the executives, a man in a gray suit with too much gel in his hair, let out a nervous laugh. Is everything all right? We really should continue the click. The sound of the magnetic locks engaging was soft, almost polite. But 20 pairs of eyes went wide as the heavy glass doors sealed shut with a finality that made stomachs drop. What the hell? Someone started. Sit down. Jae-shin didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The two words carried enough weight to make grown men sink back into their chairs like scolded children. He moved around the table toward Kathy, each step measured, controlled. When he reached her, he didn't grab, didn't demand. He simply placed one hand on the small of her back, steady, warm, grounding, and guided her to stand beside him. "Gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping over the room with the kind of coldness that preceded executions. "We have a problem." No one spoke. No one moved. Jae-shin gently tilted Kathy's face toward the light. The bruise was fully visible now, the makeup smudged away by sweat and fear. Ugly. Violent. Unmistakable. Someone in this room put their hands on her. His voice was silk over steel. Someone thought they could touch what belongs to me and walk away unscathed. A chair creaked. Someone's phone buzzed. No one answered it. "So here's what's going to happen." Jae-shin released Kathy but kept her close. His presence a wall between her and the room full of men who suddenly looked like what they were. Prey that had just realized it was trapped with a predator. "No one leaves until I know who did this. No one calls for help. No one makes a sound without my permission. Mr. Kwon." The man in the gray suit tried again, his voice pitching higher. "This is highly irregular. We have shareholders to answer to. We have... Do you?" Jae-shin's head tilted slightly. "Tell me, Director Lim, do your shareholders know about the 2 million you've been siphoning through the Singapore account? Do they know your mistress in Busan is pregnant?" The color drained from Lim's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked like a fish drowning in air. Jae-shin began to walk. Slowly, a predator circling. "You all sit in this room and pretend to be civilized. You shake hands. You sign contracts. You talk about markets and margins and growth." He paused behind another executive, a younger man with expensive glasses and shaking hands. "But I know what you really are." He leaned down, his voice dropping to something that barely qualified as sound. "I know about the kickbacks manager song, the offshore accounts, the deals you've been making with our competitors." Song's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" Jae-shin straightened, moving on. "Then you won't mind if I have my accountants take a closer look at your expense reports. Every receipt, every transaction, every lie." The room was beginning to crack. Kathy could see it in the way shoulders tensed, in the way eyes darted toward the locked doors, in the way sweat began to bead on foreheads that had been calm and collected 10 minutes ago. Jae-shin stopped behind another man, older, silver-haired, wearing a watch that cost more than Kathy's apartment. Executive Director Han. "Your daughter is studying abroad in London, isn't she? Interesting choice of university, especially considering they don't actually offer the degree she claims to be pursuing, but they do offer a very expensive way to hide a gambling addiction." Han's jaw tightened. "You have no right. I have every right." Jae-shin's voice hardened, the calm facade cracking just enough to show the monster underneath. "I own this building. I own this company. And whether you want to admit it or not, I own every single one of you." He stopped walking, stood in the center of the room, let the silence stretch until it felt like a living thing, pressing down on all of them. "See? Here's what you don't understand." His eyes swept across the table, landing on each man in turn. "You think I'm a CEO. You think I'm a businessman. You think because you see me in board meetings and shareholder calls that I'm one of you." He smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I'm not." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I built this empire on blood before I ever touched a spreadsheet. I learned to break bones before I learned to balance books. And every single one of you sits in this tower because I allow it, because I decided you were useful." He moved back toward Kathy, his hand finding her shoulder, steadying her even as her legs threatened to give out. "But the moment you stop being useful, the moment you disrespect what's mine, you become a problem." Jae-shin's thumb traced gentle circles on Kathy's shoulder, a stark contrast to the violence simmering in his words. "And I solve problems very, very permanently." A phone rang. No one answered it. "So, let me be clear." His voice dropped to something deadly. The person who put that bruise on her face has two choices. Confess now, and I'll make it quick. Or stay silent, and I'll tear through each of you one by one until I find the answer. His hand moved to the remote, thumb hovering over another button. And trust me, gentlemen, you don't want to see what happens when I run out of patience. The room held its breath, and somewhere, beneath the designer cologne and expensive leather, Kathy could smell fear. Jae-shin's hand was still on Kathy's shoulder when the memory hit him. Unexpected, unwanted, but undeniable. 3 months ago. Maybe 4. Time had a way of blurring when you spent 18-hour days building an empire that existed in both boardrooms and back alleys. He'd been in his office, the real one on the 52nd floor that most employees didn't even know existed. The one with reinforced walls and encrypted phones, and a safe that held things shareholders would never see. He'd been reviewing surveillance footage from one of his less legitimate operations when the door had opened without a knock. Most people who walked into his private office uninvited didn't walk back out. But it wasn't an assassin or a rival or a traitor. It was her. Kathy Stone, wearing that same outdated maid's uniform, carrying a tray with a sandwich he hadn't ordered and tea that smelled like his grandmother's kitchen in Seoul. She'd set it down on the edge of his desk, not in the center where it would demand attention, but off to the side where he could ignore it if he wanted to. "You missed dinner," she'd said. Not accusing, not pitying, just stating a fact. He'd looked up at her then, really looked, and seen something he hadn't expected. She wasn't intimidated by him, wasn't trying to impress him or manipulate him or get something from him. She was just there, present, real. "I don't remember asking for this," he'd said, his voice cold out of habit. "You didn't." She'd turned to leave, then paused. "But you also didn't eat lunch. Or breakfast. And before you tell me it's none of my business, I'm pre-med." Was pre-med. Whatever. She'd shrugged, a small gesture that somehow made her seem braver than men twice her size. "Your body needs fuel. Even dragons have to eat. Dragons." No one called him that. Not to his face. Not unless they wanted to end up in the river. But the way she'd said it casual, almost teasing, like she was talking to a person instead of a monster, had done something strange to the ice around his chest. She'd left before he could respond. Left him sitting there with a sandwich and tea and the strange, uncomfortable feeling that someone had just seen him. Not Jae-shin Kwon, CEO. Not the Korean Mafia boss who controlled half the city's underground. Just him. He'd eaten the sandwich. After that, she'd started appearing. Not every night. Not predictably. But on the nights when he worked latest, when the weight of his double life pressed down like concrete, she'd slip in with food. Sometimes Korean. Sometimes not. Always exactly what he needed, even though he never asked. They didn't talk much. She never pried. Never asked questions about the phone calls she definitely overheard, or the bruised knuckles he sometimes came back with, or the way his suit jacket occasionally smelled like gunpowder. She just existed in his space, made him tea, left quietly, and somehow, without either of them acknowledging it, she'd become the 1 hour of his day that felt like he could breathe. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Jae-shin standing in the locked boardroom with 20 terrified executives and the woman who'd somehow become the only person in this building who mattered. The silence was stretching too long. He could feel it in the way bodies shifted, in the way eyes darted toward the locked doors, in the way someone's breathing had gone shallow and panicked. Good. Fear made people sloppy, and sloppy people made mistakes. This is absurd. The voice came from the middle of the table. Vice President Park, older, gray at the temples, expensive suit barely concealing the gut of a man who'd spent too many years behind a desk. His face was red, whether from anger or fear. Jae-shin couldn't tell. "You're holding us hostage over a servant? Have you lost your mind?" The room went silent again. But this time the silence was different. Sharper. Colder. Jae-shin didn't move. Didn't react. Just let the words hang in the air like a noose waiting to tighten. "A servant," he repeated, his voice so soft it barely qualified as sound. "That's what you see when you look at her?" Park straightened in his chair, apparently mistaking Jae-shin's calm for agreement. "With all due respect, sir, we have a quarterly review to complete. Shareholders are expecting numbers. The board is expecting strategy. And you're derailing everything over a maid who probably fell on her way to work." "Fell," Jae-shin said flatly. "These things happen." Park waved a dismissive hand. "Servants are clumsy. They're not used to the pace of corporate environments. She probably—" "Say servant one more time." Jae-shin's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Please, give me a reason." Park's mouth opened. Closed. Some animal instinct, the one that had kept humans alive when they were still prey, finally kicked in. He seemed to remember that the man at the head of the table wasn't just his boss, wasn't just a CEO, was something far more dangerous. But pride was a funny thing. It made smart men stupid, made cowards brave, made vice presidents think they were untouchable. "Look," Park said, forcing a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. She's help. They come and go. They know their place. Or at least, they should. They know their place." 4 words. That's all it took. Jae-shin moved so fast, 3 executives flinched. He was around the table in 4 strides, standing directly behind Park's chair, one hand resting on the leather headrest, the casual touch somehow more threatening than a knife to the throat. "Their place," Jae-shin repeated. "Tell me, Vice President Park, where exactly is their place?" Park's Adam's apple bobbed. "I just meant, no, I'm curious." Jae-shin leaned down, his mouth inches from Park's ear. "Because it seems like you have very strong opinions about where certain people belong, about who deserves respect and who doesn't, about who matters and who's disposable." Sweat began to bead on Park's forehead. "Sir, I think you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" Jae-shin's hand moved from the headrest to Park's shoulder. The grip looked casual, light, but Kathy saw the way Park's whole body went rigid, the way his breathing hitched. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you think you're above certain people, that your position gives you the right to dismiss them, to hurt them, to put your hands on them when they see something they shouldn't." The last sentence landed like a bomb in quiet room. Park's face went white, then red, then white again. I would never." "Wouldn't you?" Jae-shin straightened, releasing Park's shoulder. But he didn't step back, didn't give him space to breathe. Strange. Because Kathy here has a very specific bruise. And I'm very good at reading injuries, Vice President Park. It comes with my extracurricular experience. He circled the chair, putting himself between Park and the rest of the room. "That bruise is exactly the size and shape of a right hand. A large hand. The kind that comes from a man, not a fall. And the angle suggests she was struck while standing, probably backed against a wall, by someone taller than her." Park's hands clenched into fists on the armrests. "This is speculation. You can't—" The knuckle pattern suggests the attacker was wearing a ring, something thick, probably a college ring or a signet. Jae-shin's eyes dropped to Park's right hand, to the gold band on his ring finger, Harvard class of '98, if Jae-shin remembered the file correctly. "Want to show me your hand, Park?" "I don't have to show you anything." "No?" Jae-shin smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Then you won't mind if I check the security footage from yesterday evening. Say, around 7 p.m.? The cameras in the executive corridor are quite high definition. I can pull them up right now if you'd like." Park's face had gone from red to a sickly gray. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The room watched in silence as a man who'd spent 30 years climbing corporate ladders realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go but down. "It was an accident," Park finally said, his voice cracking. She was in the wrong place. She heard things she shouldn't have heard." The room erupted. Gasps. Curses. One executive actually stood up before remembering the doors were locked and sinking back down. Jae-shin held up one hand. Silence fell like a guillotine blade. "What things?" His voice was eerily calm. What exactly did Kathy hear that was worth leaving a bruise on her face? Park's jaw worked. His eyes darted to the locked doors, to the windows, to anywhere but Jae-shin's face. I had a meeting. A private meeting. With. That's confidential." "With who, Park?" The calm was starting to crack. Underneath it was something that made the air in the room feel thin, hard to breathe. "Who were you meeting with in my building after hours without my knowledge?" Park stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "I don't have to answer to you. I have rights. I have lawyers. You can't keep us here like prisoners and expect—" "You were selling company secrets." Kathy's voice was quiet. Small. But in the silent room, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned toward her. She was still standing beside Jae-shin, her hands twisted in her apron, her voice shaking but steady. "I heard you. In the corridor. You were on the phone with someone. You said you had the quarterly numbers early, that you'd have the merger details by Friday, that your contact would pay double if you could get the client list." Park's face twisted into something ugly. "You little—" "She saw you." Jae-shin's voice cut through whatever venom Park was about to spit. "She overheard you committing corporate espionage, and instead of coming to me, you decided to silence her, to intimidate her, to make her too afraid to speak." "She's a liability." Park's composure shattered completely. His face was red, his voice rising. "She's nobody. A maid who can't keep her nose out of places it doesn't belong. I did what I had to do to protect my interests." "Your interests?" Jae-shin's voice dropped to something deadly. "Not the company's interests. Not the shareholders' interests. Yours. I've given 30 years to this company." Park was shouting now, spittle flying from his mouth. 30 years. And for what? To watch you walk in and take over? To answer to some Korean thug who thinks a suit makes him legitimate? The room held its breath. "I was protecting my future," Park continued, his hands shaking. "I was securing my retirement. And I'll be damned if some girl who scrubs toilets for a living is going to—" He reached into his jacket. Time slowed. Kathy saw the gun before anyone else did a sleek black thing that looked wrong in the pristine boardroom. Park's hand was shaking as he raised it, but the barrel was pointed directly at her chest. "She's the only witness," Park said, his voice high and panicked. "If she's gone, there's no proof, no evidence, just your word against mine." Jae-shin moved. 1 second he was standing beside Kathy. The next he was in front of her, his body a wall between her and the gun. His left hand shot out, catching Park's wrist and twisting with a crack that made half the room flinch. The gun clattered to the floor. Park screamed. But Jae-shin wasn't done. His right hand came up in a strike so fast Kathy barely saw it palm to Park's throat, cutting off his air. Park's eyes went wide, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Jae-shin spun him, using his own momentum against him, and slammed him face first into the conference table hard enough to crack the wood. 3 seconds. That's all it had taken. Park was on his stomach, his arm wrenched behind his back at an angle that made one executive turn green. Blood poured from his broken nose, pooling on the imported mahogany. He was making sounds half sobs, half gasps that barely qualified as human. Jae-shin didn't let go. His knee was pressed into Park's spine, his hand still controlling the broken wrist. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly calm, like he was discussing quarterly projections instead of holding a grown man down like a wolf with prey. "This Jay Shin said to the room, is what happens when you forget who I really am. He pressed down slightly. Park screamed. You think the suit makes me civilized. You think the office and the board meetings and the shareholder calls mean I've gone soft. Jay Shin's eyes swept across the terrified faces around the table. But I built this empire in blood before I ever touched a spreadsheet, and I will burn it all down before I let anyone hurt what's mine. The door at the far end of the room opened. Not the main doors, those were still locked, but a side entrance that most people didn't even know existed. 2 men entered. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing black tactical gear, their faces impassive, their movements efficient. They moved like soldiers, or worse. Jay Shin released Park and stepped back, straightening his jacket. Take him. The men moved forward without a word, hauling Park up by his arms. He was crying now, babbling apologies and excuses and promises that fell on deaf ears. Wait, Park gasped. Wait, please. I have a family. I have kids. You can't. You should have thought of that before you put your hands on her. Jay Shin's voice was ice. Before you tried to kill her in my boardroom, before you made the mistake of thinking I wouldn't find out, the men dragged Park toward the door. He fought, struggling against their grip, his expensive shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Please, I'll give you everything. Names, numbers, contacts. I'll testify. The door closed behind them. The sound was final. Absolute. The room was silent except for someone's ragged breathing. Jay Shin turned back to the remaining executives. His suit wasn't even wrinkled. His hair was still perfectly in place, but something in his eyes had changed. The mask had slipped. They'd seen the monster underneath. Let me be very clear, he said quietly. What you just witnessed stays in this room. There will be no police reports, no investigations, no questions. As far as anyone outside these walls is concerned, Vice President Park resigned for personal reasons, effective immediately. He paused, letting it sink in. And if anyone has questions about what happened here today, I suggest you remember that Park made 2 critical mistakes. He touched something that belonged to me, and he forgot that I don't call the police when I have a problem. Jay Shin pressed a button on the remote. The magnetic locks disengaged with a soft click. Meeting adjourned. Get out. They moved like rats fleeing a sinking ship, scrambling for jackets and phones and briefcases, tripping over chairs in their desperation to reach the doors. In less than 30 seconds, the room was empty except for Jay Shin and Kathy. The silence that followed was deafening. Kathy was shaking. She couldn't seem to stop. Her hands were trembling, her legs felt like water, and her breath was coming in short gasps that she couldn't quite control. Kathy. Jay Shin's voice was different now, softer. The monster had retreated, leaving behind something that looked almost human. Look at me. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she'd have to acknowledge what had just happened, what he'd done, what he was. Kathy. She looked up. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were concerned, worried, real. Are you hurt? He asked. The question was so absurd she almost laughed. Was she hurt? She'd just watched him break a man's arm and threaten to do worse. She'd seen him transform from CEO to something else entirely. She'd stared down a gun barrel and only survived because he'd moved fast enough to shield her. No, she whispered. I'm not hurt. Good. He stepped closer, and she noticed for the first time that his hands were gentle as they reached for her face. His fingers traced the edge of the bruise barely a touch, feather-light. I'm sorry I didn't see this sooner. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. You couldn't have known. I should have. His jaw tightened. You've been coming to my office for months, bringing me food, making sure I eat, treating me like a person instead of a monster, and I was so busy playing CEO that I didn't notice when someone hurt you. Kathy's throat tightened. I'm just a maid. No. The word was firm. Final. You're not. He stepped back, shrugging out of his suit jacket and draping it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body heat, smelling like expensive cologne, and something underneath that was just him. "You're done serving others, Kathy." He said it like a fact, like a law being written into existence. No more uniforms, no more scrubbing floors, no more hiding in bathrooms trying to cover bruises because you're afraid of losing a job that pays you barely enough to survive. "I don't understand." "You work for me now." Directly. He picked up his phone from the table, already texting someone. "You'll have an office on the executive floor, a salary that reflects your actual worth, and access to resources that will let you finish that medical degree you never got to complete." Kathy's head was spinning. Why? Why would you do that? Jae-shin looked at her, then really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Something that looked almost like vulnerability. "Because you're the only person in this building who sees me," he said quietly. "The real me. Not the CEO, not the monster. Just me. And I've spent too many years pretending to be something I'm not, to let go of the one person who makes me feel human." He held out his hand. "Not demanding. Not commanding. Offering. Come with me. Let me take care of you the way you've been taking care of me." Kathy looked at his hand. At his face. At the man who'd just destroyed someone's life to protect hers. She should be terrified. Should run. Should put as much distance between herself and this dangerous, complicated, violent man as possible. But her fingers were already moving, slipping into his palm, letting him pull her close. "Okay," she whispered. Jae-shin's arm wrapped around her waist, steady and sure. He guided her toward the door, not the main entrance where the executives had fled, but the private one where his men had taken park, where his real world existed. "One more thing," he said as they walked. "What?" He stopped, turning her to face him. His hand came up to cup her cheek, careful of the bruise. "Anyone who touches you again doesn't get a trial. They don't get lawyers or mercy or second chances. They get me. Understand?" It should have sounded like a threat, like possession, like ownership. But in his voice, Kathy heard something else. Protection. Promise. A vow written in blood and kept in shadows. "I understand," she said. He smiled, then a real smile that transformed his face from beautiful to devastating. "Good." And then he carried her out of the boardroom, past the empty executive floor, into the private elevator that led to places most employees would never see, to a world where monsters wore suits and maids became partners, and love was spelled in broken bones and locked doors. Behind them, the conference room stood empty. Blood still stained the mahogany table. A crack ran through the expensive wood, and somewhere in the building, 20 executives were learning to keep their mouths shut and their hands to themselves. Because in Quan Tower, there was only one rule that mattered. Don't touch what belongs to the dragon.